The Rebel Capitalist Show. Talking about stupid government policies, let's dive into the SPR. I know you've been talking about this.
Oh, boy.
It's one of your favorite topics on Macro Voices.
Well, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created in 1975 for very, very good reason, which is the Arab oil embargo was really not that big of a geopolitical event at the time. But the United States, which at that point was no longer energy sufficient, and don't let anybody tell you that the US is energy self-sufficient now. That's nonsense. The Biden administration said that a few times, but it's absolutely not true. We import a whole lot of oil and we could not get by without it. So we have to have imports of oil. And what the powers that be realized after the Arab oil embargo is they said, wait a minute, this was kind of about price and you know, the Yom Kippur War and policy, and you know, that all got sorted out. But what would we do if we were ever in an actual war situation where the only way you can run the ships and the planes and everything else is to have petroleum to make jet fuel with, and you know, be ready to refuel all the F-18s and F-35s, whatever they fly these days, and run the war machine and do all that. What if somebody were to use some kind of shipping blockade to stop those ships from getting through, and the US were cut off from oil? We could be literally crippled to the point where we're unable to make war and defend ourselves, and we could be in really deep doo-doo. So what they did more than 50 years ago in 1970, well, I guess it was 47 years ago, not more than 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago, in 1975, they established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which can hold up to about 700 and I forget, around 750 million barrels of oil. And the idea, and even that is not very much. We use 20 million barrels a day. So, and some of that is produced inside the United States. We don't import 20 million barrels a day, but at the rate that we've been drawing it down, and what's happened, the reason for having the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is it's strategic. It's for not just a slightly rainy day. It's for when it's really, really pouring outside. Yeah, when it's life or death, and you realize that the next tactic that I think is very possibly coming in this war with Vladimir Putin is Putin cuts off all Russian oil. Oil prices go to $350 in the matter of 2 weeks. And all of the sudden, nobody can afford anything. And we've got a question mark as to whether we're going to be able to supply the oil that's needed in order to just run the military. And it's a big uncertainty. Well, that's what you've got a Strategic Petroleum Reserve for, was if the US ever got cut off from foreign oil, we would have enough of those supplies in stock in order to get through the storm, use the oil that we have in-house in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to run the military and go kick some ass and, you know, fix the war and get things to a point where we've got oil again. That was the whole point of it. For most of the 47 years that we've had this thing, we didn't really need it. You know, it was started in 75, 15 years later, we got the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Soviet Union, and there weren't really a lot of big strategic threats anymore. But we continued to keep the Strategic Petroleum Reserve just so we would have it in case we ever needed it. Well, right now, we've got talk of nuclear escalation with Russia. We've got the rhetoric and the talk that's in the system right now is the most dangerous that we've had since the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, in 60 years. This is finally the time where it looks like we may be headed to a period, let's say a year from now, where we really urgently need that Strategic Petroleum Reserve in order to save the country's existence. That's how important it is. What are we doing right now? President Biden is draining it down at the rate of about 7 million barrels per week, thinking that that's going to somehow help to address short-term gasoline prices through the summer and, get him through the midterm elections or something. It's not going to work. It's already making the situation worse. And what we're doing is, after sitting on this strategic petroleum reserve for 45 years, all of a sudden, as the tidal wave is actually in sight approaching the shore, President Biden decides to cancel the flood insurance and sell off the oil and the SPR in a desperate and ineffective attempt to control prices at the pump. It's not going to work long term, and we don't have enough oil to do that. The SPR is now down to its lowest level since 1986. It's below 500 million barrels. It's because we consume more than we did back in 1986.
I was going to say our economy is a lot bigger.
So in terms of the way you really want to think about it, which is how many days of American oil consumption are there in the SPR if we didn't produce any and we just had to live off of it like a piggy bank? It's down to about 26 days right now. Now, it wouldn't ever really come down to 26 days because you're still producing oil in the US. But if somebody were thinking about this, they would say, wait a minute, the dynamics of the entire oil industry have changed dramatically in the last 40 years since they established this thing. We used to be stockpiling the light sweet crude, which is easy to refine. That's, kind of what we wanted to have in there in case we needed it. But these days, the oil that is produced in the US, the shale oil, is super, super light. That means it needs to be, you can't refine it in an American refinery the way it is, the way it comes out of the ground. It has to be blended down with a heavier blend stock. Where does all of that heavy blend stock come from? It's imported. We don't make it in the United States at all. It all gets imported. So you would think somebody would be thinking here and say, wait a minute, what we really need is to have the entire SPR filled with heavy blend stock, the stuff that you need to mix with American oil, so that we could have the American oil and the SPR together in the right proportions in order to supply our refineries and make the oil that we need in order to, have finished products, create jet fuel, and be able to win the war. We're not doing any of that. All we're doing is taking this big, huge piggy bank of crude oil, and we're selling it off as if, there were no consequence to doing so.
And that's not even the problem. It's the refiners.
That's right. And it's not going to do anything to change the cost of refining. And if anything, what we should be doing here is we should be looking at the SPR in terms of what kind of oil it contains. Look for what kind of oil we most urgently need to supplement that with, so that we would have all of the right combinations to mix together to create our own oil from American, American produced shale oil. Needs to be blended down. So we'd want to stock up and fill the SPR all the way up to its absolute capacity with just the right grades of blend stock, so that, normally, if you've got a reserve that's supposed to be there just in case there's a war or something, and you go for 40 or 50 years and there is no big war and you didn't really need it, and all of a sudden it looks like the war might be coming, that's the time to fill it up, not the time to drain it. It's insane that we're doing this. And it's not having any effect. And if we were to continue, what's going to happen is, if we continue and the prices go up and somebody says it is so irresponsible, nobody's even saying this at this point, I don't know why, but if it ever were to become a public talking point and somebody said, you got to stop draining the SPR at 7 million barrels a week. If they stopped suddenly, that would spike the price of gasoline, and everybody would say, oh my God. So supposedly the Biden administration, they wanted to look good. So what they did, in the spring is they said, we're going to have a plan for replenishing. See, we're very responsible about these things. We've got a plan for how come fall at the end of summer driving season, we're going to replenish all of that oil in the SPR that we just took out. Trust us, we're the government. Well, I'm sure that probably President Biden actually thinks he's going to be able to do that. And he probably thinks that, well, once we get through the summer and summer driving season's over, price of oil is going to go back down to $60 and we'll be able to replenish all that oil at $60. What happens when we get to Labor Day and the price of oil is already at $140 and the price of gasoline is at $7? And at that point, do you think he's going to stop draining the SPR? I mean, how could he stop then, right? How could you, you're coming into election season, you're going to stop taking oil out of the SPR and you're going to allow that to spike gasoline prices just into the fall elections? You're not going to do that.
Yeah,
so
you
like know
QE,
there's
Eric. It's like QE.
So you know that there's
there's
no way that they're going to stop once they've started. Well, guess what, George? The whole thing, the remaining 500, it's actually 490 million barrels of oil that we have in the SPR now, down from 700 and something. That'll only last at the current drawdown rate a little over a year. It's about 15 months. So just about the time that we would be drawing it down to zero kind of coincides with about when I was thinking if Putin really plays hardball, we would get to an actual shooting war type of situation, as we have no strategic petroleum reserve remaining. Yeah. Meanwhile, what's the best way for Putin to game this whole system? The best thing for him to do is to be cutting a deal right now with Xi Jinping, saying, look, we got to, turn on your Chinese ability to do things quickly. You got to just build tanks, makeshift lean-to tanks if you have to. Make as many tanks as you can. Keep buying Russian oil through the summer. Keep buying when we take it off the market intentionally in order to spike prices higher. We're still going to give China a good deal. Keep buying it then so we don't have to shut in our wells. And we're going to keep stockpiling it in Russia too. We're going to take it off the market. And just as we've taken all of that oil off the market and we've spiked prices to the moon, that's when the U.S. is going to run out of its SPR and not have any left to drain down. And that's when we're really going to be in a strong strategic position. I think that Putin is smart enough to have all of this stuff figured out and all the dominoes lined up in a row. And everything the West does, every time they do something, they're all proud of themselves. Look at us. We just imposed very, very tough sanctions. We're going to punish Russia. Result of that, higher prices for Americans, higher prices for Europeans, and higher oil revenue and higher oil profits for Russia.
Yeah.
And China gets a bargain. Discounted prices.
Yeah, it's always a stronger counterpunch.